that tapestry that we're going to invoke as we go through our conversation. And I will make my promise to you that if I have not actually addressed your question, I will, because as you were actually asking your questions, I actually was connecting with them. So I'm going to start with history. I like to start with history. But I like to start with history using the following metaphor. For the last approximately 430 years, we've actually found ourselves moving increasingly into a reductionist paradigm that says that the unity of value exchange across our globe, across humanity, has to be denominated in a thing we call currency. Now, it's a very interesting theory, and it's actually a relatively modern contrivance, and if we think about it in a historical context, currency, at its fundamental, is actually the anomaly in the human story. It is not the mandate. I point out to most people who actually believe themselves some degree of aware in economics that the notion of currency as it's currently incorporated is a notion that was established in 1152. 1152 is when the Knights Templar actually issued the first letters of credit, which actually serves as the first legal tender note transfer that ever took place in modern recorded history. Before that, the coin of the realm actually had intrinsic value. It actually had a nominal value, but it also had intrinsic value. And it was not until the creation of the letter of credit, which we actually now have permanently until probably the end of this year, permanently incorporated into this thing. Now, I'm always intrigued when people talk to me about currency and allege that there's some permanence to it, because what I think many people fail to understand is that this thing actually is merely a contract. It actually is a contract not in a kind of metaphysical sense, it's actually a contract in a literal sense. As evidenced under common law, not under U.S. law, under common law, the common law requirement that there is a binding obligation with a signatory on this thing. For those of you who haven't read your bills lately, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That's the salutation on this thing. And that it's signed by a person who actually has beautiful scripted handwriting, the Treasurer of the United States. There's something very interesting about this thing. And I'm going to do something which is actually going to both take a literal and a metaphysical meaning at the same time. This is the moment of magic in this show. So we're going to get the magic out of the way with first. I'm going to do something, and all of you are going to have the ability to know what I'm thinking when I do this. What am I doing? I'm sorry?
Looking for a watermark.
I'm looking for a watermark. Now, I told you that I was going to do something, and then all of a sudden I was going to have mind control. It's amazing. I do this, you actually know what I'm doing. It's amazing. Why is that? Why is it that we actually look to our bills when we look to the light? Why do we do that? What's the importance of that? We want to see if it's real. We want to see if it actually has value. Real value. Now, an interesting little factoid for those of you interested in little factoids, if you go back to the Duke of Sforz in the 15th century, you actually find out why we have to do this. Because it was the Duke of Sforz in the 15th century that actually first counterfeited notes in Europe. He learned that the way to destabilize an economy is to counterfeit its currency. Because he understood that the control of a civilization is based on the perception, not the reality, the perception of the redeemability of its notes. Now, just stop for a second, because I just answered most of your questions. I just did. So we can just go have wine and cheese. The moment that you actually undermine the reality of the perception of the stability of this contract ceases to have its value. Now, the Duke of Swords was a very interesting fellow because he did one other thing. He actually tested how much of a currency you have to forger before you actually can overtake a kingdom. This study was actually carried out several other times in history. In our more modern times, the last major study that was done on this was done by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s when he was planning to counterfeit the pound. He actually did the same calculations the Duke of Swords did to actually figure out how many false pound notes he had to mint before he could actually take over UK by taking over its economy. The US government also did the same study prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion. And we actually were looking at how much of the Cuban peso we had to counterfeit before we could actually destabilize the Cuban economy. These are all wonderful experiences in the recognition that all we have to do is counterfeit these things and we can take over a country. Now, some people believe in conspiracies and all kinds of other things. I don't. I believe in reality. And the reality is there's a conspiracy. And the reality of the conspiracy is somebody is counterfeiting our currency right now. And somebody is counterfeiting our currency to take something over right now. One of the great comic ironies of this particular exercise is we are the enemy. This may go down in history as the first time that a country attacked itself, counterfeiting its own currency to actually take itself over. Now, there's an interesting, wonderful metaphysical mind wrap that has to go on to actually accomplish that, which is actually quite a spectacular feat. That you actually have to get into a really interesting space to say, okay, why would we want to take over our own currency by counterfeiting our currency? And by the way, when I say counterfeiting, I actually mean counterfeiting. You will note that both presidential candidates, the President and the Secretary of the Treasury within the past week, have, after issuing all of their grave warnings about the state of the economy, have actually reassured people of two absolutely safe haven locations to put money. You ready for them? We can all recite them. We all know them. We've all heard them coming out of the mouths of the most educated folks on the planet. Treasuries and deposits, because the FDIC is rock solid. Rock solid. I'm sure those of you who appreciate rock solid investments would be interested to understand a tiny bit of the metaphysics of insurance. Insurance is actually not created for your benefit. Newsflash. Insurance is not created for your benefit. Insurance is a means of selling a future option on your fear. That's how insurance works. The first insurance of modern history is actually the insurance that comes out of fire insurance. And fire insurance has a very grim history, because what you found out was that wonderful precursor to AIG, Chicago Fire and Title, for those of you not familiar with it, in the U.S. domiciled risk environment, actually came up with quite an elaborate way to sell fire insurance. What a gentleman did for 7 years was he actually monitored the fires in Chicago. What he realized was that there's a correlation to the moment that a house burns down based on when coal deliveries took place. And it turns out that the reason for that is if you look at the clapboard and wood house construction in Chicago and you actually go back and look at when they burnt down, when coal cellars were filled with coal dust, you had an explosive environment, quite literally, because people would light their furnaces, the coal dust would explode, the house would burn down. And so the very profitable fire insurance that came out of that Chicago Fire and Title launch of what is now AIG was a fire insurance that actually knew the latency of how long it took coal dust to settle out of the air. You would be approached to buy fire insurance after your coal delivery and after your house didn't burn down. Very profitable business. They sold a fear that you didn't need to have. And, lo and behold, quite mysteriously, their renewal cycles were based on coal delivery cycles. So you were off policy when the next load of coal came. Isn't that a great deal? The kind of the day you needed the insurance, I'm sorry, your policy expired yesterday. This would be wonderful to make up if you actually believed in conspiracies. The problem is, that's actually how it worked. Some of you are probably familiar with the fact that on September 10th at midnight, Lloyd's of London went off policy on the New York Port Authority. AIG picked up the policy at 12:01 a.m. on September 11th, 2001. Wouldn't it be a bummer to actually know that the premium check is in the mail for the Twin Tower or for the World Trade Center when a plane goes into it? Wouldn't that be kind of a bummer to find out that you just had taken on the policy? And do you suppose it would be really great if you were sitting at Lloyd's going, whew, thank God we're off that one, the day the towers come down? What was being sold? What was being sold was the perception of fear and the perception of risk. So when people say the safe place to go is where FDIC is, a couple statistics which are helpful. When the FDIC no longer publicly reported its liquidity reserves, and you heard me say that correctly, when they no longer publicly reported their liquidity reserves, their statutory requirement by Congress was to collect premiums in the amount of 1.25% of the facing exposure. 1.25%. Ironically, on the last report that went to any Congressional Oversight Committee or any GAO or Inspector General report, the actual reserve ratio was 1.23%, meaning that somehow or another they figured out a way to drop below the statutorily required reserve rate, and then they stopped reporting. The data is not helpful, by the way, because if you look at the data and look at their actual collections, you actually find that it was decreasing when it passed the statutory limit and was still on the way down. Now, according to the, quote, well-managed oversight of the Fed under, or the FDIC, under the current director, Ms. Baer, she has assured us, albeit without presenting any numbers, she has assured us that the liquidity problem doesn't exist in the FDIC. She's assured us of that, and she's assured us of that in many congressional testimonies. So I'm sure we're fine, and I'm sure you would all be fine to realize that your wonderful FDIC insurance policy actually has a liquidity backing of 1.23 cents on every dollar of your investment risk. Rest assured, that's not where the story ends. It's an insurance policy. It is not a guarantee. An insurance policy, and all you have to do is ask the state of New York or the state of California, an insurance policy is a contract against an actual damage. There has to be a contractual event of damage. There's an interesting problem with the charter of the FDIC, and the problem with that charter is that it relies on the rating of a financial institution to actually be materially and correctly represented in the information that's presented when regulators come in and oversee the risk. Interestingly enough, for those of you not familiar with it, I would encourage you to look up a program called the CAMELS, C-A-M-E-L-S, which, by the way, is an acronym that stands for Capital Adequacy, Asset Quality, Management, Earnings, Liquidity, and Susceptibility to Market Risk. Those are the 6 legs of the camel. You heard that right. The 6 legs of the camel that the camel stands on. What's particularly interesting is if you look at how the insurance premiums are calculated for the FDIC, the insurance premiums are calculated off of 60% of the value of the insurance premium is derived from 3 of those factors. 1, capital adequacy. 2, management, and you heard that correctly, management, that's one of the top tiers. And you should be comfortable with that, given the management expertise we've seen in the financial markets lately. You should be very comfortable that they've really got a lock on their awareness of their risk.